So a couple of months ago, I put out a video called "Are Video Game Reviews Still Relevant?" And I argued that they weren't. Basically, as I see it, we have two kinds of quote-unquote reviews floating around YouTube. One is the paid product placement. A company gives a popular reviewer a code and a payment, and they do a review on it. And that is a kind of commercial. And while it might be interesting for me to see what a new game looks like, plays like, maybe I like the personality of the person reviewing it, and again, I use that term very loosely, as information, it tells me nothing. Because if I'm getting a payment from a company, I'm not going to be overly negative or critical. My economic future is tied to that early access, and indeed, in some instances, that payment. Then you have videos like Digital Foundry that kind of gleefully list all of the technical merits of a game and explain how different effects are produced. Again, very interesting and often well done, but it doesn't offer me an independent evaluation of the product as a consumer. And as such, again, it offers me very little value in helping me to determine if I'll like a game and should I buy it. So I claim that if you wanted to get away from these two poles that exist out there, you would need a Consumer Reports style video game review. Number one, that's completely independent, that takes no advertising from any video game companies or no advertising whatsoever. Consumer Reports, if you're not familiar, is a magazine that reviews all sorts of consumer products, from cars to electronics to home appliances, and is a subscription service. There is no advertisement in Consumer Reports. The other thing it does is it works with a set of normative assumptions about what the consumers of that product would want. And they use their independence and these set of assumptions to give what I think is obviously not an objective assessment. I mean, pure objectivity is not possible in these kind of things. But it gives me, as a buyer of a product, a reasonable idea of whether or not this is something that I should purchase now or in the future. And what I want to do is offer what I think are a set of fair normative assumptions about video gamers that could be used to build a site or a service that offers truly independent video game reviews. So the first assumption is that players want games to release in a reasonably playable, functional state. So if a game has incredible amounts of online bugs, or offline bugs for that matter, if the multiplayer isn't working properly or it's poorly balanced, that's a problem. And that is something that you could easily identify and really ding a game for on release. And yeah, you could update the review and say, hey, 6 months later, they got their act together. Think of Street Fighter V. I mean, could we really say that this game was in a playable, functional state on release when you couldn't even log in to the servers, if I recall, on the first 2 or 3 days? So again, why not point that out? Why not take that into account in a review? Next assumption, I think, is also fairly straightforward and easy to present to a buyer, and that is the true cost of play. What is the game? What do I really have to pay to play this game? Obviously, as we know, with the amount of DLC, microtransaction, loot boxes, games are no longer $60 or $40 or whatever they release at. AAA games release at $60. But, of course, you have the Enhanced Edition, you have the Ultimate Edition, and you have all of these things that you have to purchase if you want, oftentimes, the full experience. So, a objective, independent review could point out which of these myriad things that you're asked to buy are really necessary for the core game. So, you might say costumes are not necessary, skins are not necessary, but maybe obviously DLC access to, say, new fighters in a fighting game, or new levels, or, hey, these maps are coming out 4 months down the road and they're going to split the player base if it's an online shooter. Those things matter. And I think increasingly we need to have an analysis of these in-game economies and figure out what is not only the price of play, but the price of progression. I mean, that's the whole thing about loot boxes and something like Hearthstone or Overwatch or the Star Wars game. It seemed like if I want to progress in this game that I paid for, there is an additional price to that. It needs to be analyzed, needs to be mentioned, along with, again, the DLC model and stuff like that. And once you have that, I think the third assumption is that players want good value for money. So you have to measure the price against some unit of time. Now, traditionally, that has been gameplay hours. Hey, I buy this RPG, I've got 80 hours worth of gameplay, but I don't know that that's a useful unit of measurement anymore. I mean, a lot of games can offer hours and hours of gameplay, but a lot of it, are sort of meaningless fetch quests or side activities, cooking or crafting or all of that stuff that really are not central to the game itself. So I think we need to come up with a unit of meaningful player engagement, some kind of unit of engaged time. And for me, that is the week. And I say that because I find, and it's going to vary from person to person, obviously I'm an adult, I work, I don't have all the amount of time to spend on a game. So for me, if I can get 2 weeks out of a video game, where I'm playing this video game consistently every day for 2 weeks, I feel like I have my money's worth. Yakuza 6, good example. It's not the best Yakuza game compared to recent entries, but I found myself, from when that released, which I think was about 2 weeks ago, until right now, I played that consistently. So I'm not saying it has to be the engaged week of gameplay. Maybe that's just kind of a personal thing, but we need to come up with some unit of engaged time where we can say, hey, the price per unit is good. Now, this next category is a tough one. Innovation. I think people playing video games, I think in fact the whole history of gaming has always relied on the sense that as time progresses, as I get new systems, as platforms mature, I'm going to have new and innovative games to play. That was pretty easy to do in the 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit era. Now it's becoming a little bit harder to quantify innovation. So I would see it as innovation relative to certain genre standards. Maybe it's not the most innovative game ever, but if I can compare it to recent releases in a genre, is it attempting something new or different, and is it succeeding at that? Again, that's something that I think is reasonably clear to present. I mean, consider something like Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. I mean, it was certainly an innovation on the Zelda formula, and also, in certain respects, an innovation on open world gameplay. And that's, again, a high watermark, but that's the sort of thing that we have to look at. Next up would be technical merits. And I think, again, there's a tradition in video games where players and consumers, they want, with, again, as platforms mature and new platforms come out, they want to see technical improvements to their game. So things like resolution, FPS, lighting techniques, all of that is worth mentioning. And again, that's where the Digital Foundry kind of stuff can come into play and better explain how those different elements of a game succeed or fail and what tech is used to achieve them. But I think, again, that's relatively straightforward. Does the game look good? Do they use the right techniques to produce the desired aesthetic effect? All of that needs to go into the review. And I think increasingly the online community needs to be analyzed. I think a lot of games with heavy online components, if you've been following the channel, that's not my type of game, but I think it's clearly one of the mainstays of this industry. The reviewer would have to look at things like barriers to entry. Is the skill level of the community such that this needs to be your only game that you play for 6 to 8 months to improve your skill level to be competitive? Are the servers up? Is it a friendly community and so forth? How many players are on there? What is the player base like? If I purchase a game and 2 weeks later it's dead, and again, that's something that you could update. You can, reviews essentially now are live documents. So hey, it started off with a ton of players and now there's no one playing. And if it's purely an online game, then the value of that game sinks considerably. So again, I think it's a reasonably objective thing to point out, hey, there's no one in the lobbies, so you can't really use the game. Or, hey, there's a ton of players out there, but, know going into it that you're going to struggle initially. And I think the last aspect that has to be pointed out, and maybe this is a little bit out of left field, but I think it's important, particularly if you're building a consumer advocacy model for video games, is the data privacy aspect of games. As online games, all games are essentially online, but as these connected consoles capture so much of your player input, your financial information in some cases, your habits in the game, I think consumers have a right to know what happens with that information. Case in point, I purchased the Dragon Ball Z fighting game, and I noted when I came on here to talk about that it took me, I would say, 45 seconds to a minute to scroll through all of the legal text and the user agreement. It forced you to go through all of that. It was the longest end user license agreement that I ever had to scroll through. And of course, if they're forcing you to do that, something nefarious must be going on behind all of the legalese. So this is going to be the dry part of consumer advocacy. Video game reviews is really paying a lawyer or yourself learning enough about end user license agreements to really go through that and tell the buyer, hey, this game is going to capture your voice data, or this game is going to analyze your playing habits or how you interact with players online. And I think then the educated consumer can say, is this something I want to purchase or not? It's like I said, Consumer Reports, unpopular as this kind of category might be, they do things like that with, say, backup cameras or lane monitoring or stuff like that, where they say, really, these technologies are not that expensive and should be on every new car. And hey, we're going to drop the score of cars that don't include that as standard equipment. Much in the same way that if it turns out after analyzing all of these user agreements that every company is taking your data and selling it to third parties, then they should be penalized for that. So I think if you have all these categories in place, you can produce a review that, again, it's not going to be objective, but it has these assumptions that can be objectively evaluated to a greater or lesser degree, and you could produce a review, whether a video review or a written review, that tells the player in his role as a consumer, is this product worth it?